It is the 26th of May, 2024, and I'm talking to June Schwarz. Welcome back. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Dennis. I was born in the Bronx Maternity Hospital, which we can tell was in the Bronx, New York. It was the end of World War II, and the war was over. My father didn't have a car, and there were no cabs. Supplies were short. The economy was probably not doing well. So he had to stop a private car to take my mother to the maternity hospital, which was not far away from where we lived. And in those days, they had these little private hospitals to give birth. My mother always said she had to be there for 2 weeks.
What's the
So
first place you remember living in? First apartment or
this
house?
apartment, it's the first place I lived, and then we moved to Queens.
Were there other siblings already before you were born?
Yeah, I had an older brother who recently died, very successful older brother. When I started kindergarten, my brother was in sixth grade. So he would take me to school in the morning. And then when he was no longer in that school, he went to junior high school, middle school, I would go myself. And that was a big deal to go by yourself. The only thing that my mother anyway, when it was raining, they'd come to school with boots. So feet wouldn't get wet.
Where was the apartment that you lived in?
1925 Crotona Avenue.
And you remember walking to school kind of on your own and
Yeah, and
back
coming
and forth?
home and carrying, you did paint it in the morning and you
Yeah,
had this on the easel. And I remember carrying home the painting because we're still a little wet. And, my mother was home at that time. Most moms didn't work. She did eventually go to work when I was a teenager. The
what did
whole
your
thing.
father do at that time?
At that time, I don't think he was in business, in the family business. My mother's brothers, he worked for, it was called tobacco and confectionery wholesalers. There were thousands of these little candy stores all over New York. And you would go in and you would get a pretzel or M&Ms or a Hershey bar. And some of them, they were called wet stores where they had a counter, like a
Right.
soda fountain. And he would go all over New York City and take the orders from these small merchants. So that's what he did. And by then, when I was a few years old, we always had a car because that was part of the business. That was a big thing. I remember driving to Washington, D.C. in the Baltimore area with my family in the winter. And I remember being in the motel and you could put 25 cents in to watch television for about
Wow.
15 minutes. So that was a big thing. Free TV didn't exist.
For a kid, I would imagine having a father that had a candy as part of his business would have perks. Did you have candy around all the time?
We had, but they were always like something damaged.
So you got
That
you got all the damaged candy at
like the
home.
broken pretzels
Yeah.
and the broken candy and samples of things, but never the pristine packaging. Arnie, he was almost 6 years older than me, so he was like it's almost like another generation.
What kind of a little kid were you? Were you curious? Were you girly? What did you
Oh,
enjoy?
I was a little girl, and
Yeah.
I had piano lessons and dance lessons, and just a progressive attitude about education. There were movie theaters all over. You crossed the street and there was a Lowe's theater, and then you went around the corner and there was another theater. If my parents took me to the movies, or even if I went with my friends, you never looked up what time the movie started. You would just show up. And I can't figure out why that was. And you'd sit down and then you'd watch the film. And I remember going with my parents at night because you couldn't, as a child, you couldn't go at night alone.
Right.
And they would say at a certain point, oh, this is where we came in. And they'd get up and walk in. So you watch the movies, the back half, and then you watch the front half. I have no idea why they couldn't figure out what time the movie started. It was just such a peculiar thing. I remember seeing Pinocchio and I cried. I was with my mother and I cried because Pinocchio was in the whale, and it was heart-wrenching to me. And, my mother comforted me. She said, it's only a movie, that's kind
Right.
of phrase to use. I guess we saw all the Disney things, Fantasia and whatever was being produced at the time. The Bob Hope, Dorothy L'Amour with the sarong. My brother, he was a big reader, and he took me to the library all the time. Well, I do
Yeah.
remember going to the library and getting my first library card. It was probably one of the Carnegie libraries because he donated a lot of money to build public libraries, even though he was a robber baron, but he did some good things.
Sure.
And you went into the library and you had to be able to write your name. That was the criteria for getting a library card. So we practiced at home and I could write my name in this big ledger, like what they ever did with that ledger.
Yeah.
It was such a ridiculous criteria for getting a
Sure.
library card. But I did get one, and my brother would take me to the library, and I would take out children's books, and we'd come home and we'd sit outside on the stoop, and I would read the books. I'd say, now I read them all. Now what? But
Wow.
he was good about taking me back to the library and returning the books. So,
Yeah.
oh, I love Nancy Drew mysteries. I mean, as a series. Oh my God, that was a big deal. I don't remember how much they cost, but it was a lot of money. And the library didn't have them because they
Right.
didn't consider that literature.
If somebody read Nancy Drew, would they read the Hardy Boys too, or you were
No,
one or the other?
no, girl, definitely not. I remember being in the, it's funny, I think back, the library had a big impact on my life. And I went to the library, the public library, and I liked mysteries because I liked Nancy Drew. And the book, it said the boys' book of Sherlock Holmes. I wouldn't touch it. And, it was so clear, boys, science and math, girls were home ec.
Isn't
Teaching.
it the roles and the rules were
Oh
very,
my God, they were so clearly defined. They really
yeah,
were.
yeah.
Now it's pretty much anything goes. I liked school. Teachers liked me. I had friends. I was in the Brownies and the Girl Scouts.
Did you have grandparents that were around?
Yes, my father's parents were not alive. I was named after my father's mother. Her name was Jenny. And my mother's parents were alive and they were immigrants. And my mother's mother, when I think back on it, she came to this country alone with 4 little boys. The tradition was the father, the husband came first, and then the rest of the family came. He would establish himself
Right.
a place to live and so on. And she came with those 4 little boys across the ocean. It must have taken 2-3 weeks in
Wow.
steerage. I mean, they didn't have money to be on the top deck. And I think back, and I wouldn't have made it. She was coming from Warsaw, Poland,
Wow.
probably a little town outside of Warsaw. And they lived in Harlem, which was a place where you lived, it was just another community. It wasn't a Black community at that time. That was before the Harlem Renaissance. And
Right.
before the Great Migration in the 50s of African Americans from the South. Well, my grandmother was illiterate. She never went to school. She was smart. She had 4 sons and 1 daughter, my mother, who was born here. And they had a phone. It was like a big luxury. And she could read numbers, but she didn't know whose number. She couldn't read. So
Right.
she would fold a piece of paper in a certain way to know which son it was, or she put a number 1, 2, 3, 4. So if she
Yeah.
had to call her oldest son, she knew that that was his phone number. She couldn't put his name down and read his name. And my grandfather worked, I guess you would call it the garment industry.
Right.
He made pocketbooks, and then he lost his eyesight failed. My mother and her 4 brothers helped to support them because my grandmother didn't work and my
Yeah.
grandfather couldn't anymore. My uncles and my mother decided they should have a television. It must have been in the 50s, and got them a television. And I think it was my mother or one of my uncles went over there to visit, and they were watching Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. And why were they watching it? Because they didn't know how to change the channel.
They didn't know there was multiple channels. They just thought,
They just didn't, it was like a wonderment. Oh, and we would go away in the summer. We would go to Rockaway, which is a beach community, technically part of New York City. And we would go there for the whole summer. My father would stay home and work and then come out on the weekend and then go back to work. That was a very typical routine because there was no air conditioning and people would just congregate out in the beautiful summer and, walk
Yeah.
on the boardwalk at night and fireworks on Wednesday night. And
Yeah.
then you would be on the beach and teenage boys, not girls, they would around their neck carry these big, I guess they were like styrofoam, and they
Yeah.
would have dry ice in them and they would sell ice cream. So
Yeah.
you could get an ice cream and sit on the beach, which is a wonderful thing when it's hot out. And, no sunscreen, always got
Yeah.
a terrible sunburn. You would buy copper tones
Yeah.
so you would turn brown, and that was probably the worst thing for your skin. And
Yeah.
now at this point in my life, all of the sunburns are coming out into not melanomas,
But yeah, no,
but
it
stuff you
comes
have to have
back.
removed.
Yeah. What were your parents like as a couple?
I think there was tension between them. You could see that sometimes. And well, my father died at 60.
Yeah.
So that was very young, very young. And my mother was 5 years younger than that. So
Yeah.
she was a fairly young widow. They had plans to move to Florida and they bought an apartment and then my father died. Well, he had some heart problems
Hmm.
and he also smoked. So he didn't die from his heart, he died from a cerebral hemorrhage. So my mother went to Florida and she had a next door neighbor whose brother came to visit, and the rest is history.
When you were a kid, who made you feel special?
My father. He and my brother had a lot of tension and friction. My mother was there. She certainly was there. She was
Yeah.
a very good mother. She was a good mother, and I had all the things that I needed in my life.
Yeah.
Never cried, never, went without. She was involved with the PTA, and she was before the polio vaccine, the Salk vaccine. There was called the March of Dimes, and that was a big thing. And there was like a chart, and you would put dimes in it. And my mother was a block captain, so
Interesting.
she didn't have to go around and fill up the card with the
Right.
dime. She would wait to collect all the cards from the people who were. She was like team leader.
Right.
And she'd go around and get these cards, and I don't know how they returned them eventually to the March of Dimes. My sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Post, was wonderful. She was just very kind, and she gave me special things to do, and it was a good class and good
Yeah.
group. We had this small library in school. Libraries, well, they're still not mandated in elementary school, but there was I don't think they called it Title I in those days, maybe Title VI. There was like this
Right.
funding from the federal government for library books.
Yeah.
And they put them in this room. And I was assigned the task with some other girls to put the pockets in the back and match the cars. The
Oh,
circulation.
fun, right? Yeah.
It's funny when I think back on that. I did a lot of things with libraries and eventually went to library school and became a librarian.
Yeah.
And even in high school, I worked in the library.
What do you remember about, like, was it middle school or would it be considered junior high? Like,
Junior high school. What do I remember? Well, I had a boyfriend and
you had a boyfriend in junior high.
oh yeah. But
Yeah.
he really wasn't a nice person when I think back on it. He wasn't a sincere person.
Yeah.
And after that, I don't think there were any other boyfriends.
Yeah.
I was into Joan Baez. I look like her now, but I
Yeah.
look like her then also.
Didn't she have long hair, right?
That's what I had, long,
Right.
long brown, dark brown hair. And I had a guitar and wore, jewelry that I got in the village. And I would go on peace marches.
Do you remember, like, seeing Joan Baez on television, or would you
No,
see
I
her
went to
record
concerts.
stores, or you would go to
Went to
concerts?
concert at Forest Hill Stadium. Or there would be little things in Manhattan. My friends and I would go to Joan Baez. I remember in some kind of a studio, we went to a concert. It was a big deal. I was not a rock and roller. I remember
Right.
going to the place with my friends Robin and Norma, I don't remember where we were, but we had to go to this movie theater. I think it was in Brooklyn because somebody was going to be coming off the stage and coming out outside. I was
Right.
so uncomfortable there with all these screaming. I just didn't do that. Elvis
Right.
Presley didn't do it for me.
Were there teachers in high school that you remember that had a big impact?
Junior high school, Mr. Lipman was an English teacher, and he really taught us grammar and how to speak correctly. And in high school, history teachers, I did well in English and I
Yeah.
did humanities, not math and science.
Did you ever do anything mischievous in school? Did you ever like cut class or
Are
you're a
you
good, pretty good
kidding?
kid?
Never. Even in college, in order to leave high school 6 months earlier than I was programmed to, I had
Yeah.
to take an extra history class. And I
Interesting.
remember this teacher, Mr. Kelly, because I took it, I think it was ancient history. So that would give me enough credits to leave. I said, I'd rather go to college and just get out early. And so I took this extra class, Mr. Kelly, and teachers didn't make a lot of money. They still don't make enough money. He used to say, I have to supplement my income, so I teach in a yeshiva, but they gave me a Kelly green yarmulke to wear. He was
Wow.
just funny. And then I went to college, started that spring semester. And then that summer I met Jack. CCNY, City College of New York, it's part of the city university, but then it was an independent college.
And your parents always wanted you to go to college. That was always part
My
of
mother
like,
could care less,
she didn't matter, but you
never
wanted to
encouraged
go.
me. I had a teacher, my brother always had a friend that taught guitar. So the person would come over on a Saturday and teach me. And then eventually, then I also worked in the day camps in the summer.
Did you like working at the camp?
I did. I like working with children. I enjoyed
Yeah.
that. And I remember once having a date every night during the week, from the camp. Well, recently I drove past the bowling alley that we would have gone to that was walking distance where we lived. And from the outside, it was all run down.
Oh,
The
yeah.
paint was coming off. I mean, still open, but
Yeah.
it was just in such disrepair. I
Yeah.
think people don't, there's one not near us right here, closed for years.
I know.
That in movie theaters, it just
Yeah.
bad.
Do you remember your graduation ceremony from high school?
It was actually in a landmark movie theater on Northern Boulevard and Main Street in Flushing. It was also a Lowe's theater, and somebody bought it and didn't know it was landmark and destroyed the marquee. And I think the only thing left is the ticket booth. But
Yeah.
all of those, theaters built in the 30s with the amazing interiors, they're all landmark. You can't do anything with them.
Yeah. Was it a common thing to just go into Manhattan and go see a big show or like to have
Oh,
adventures in
absolutely.
Manhattan? It was,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely. I went with my friends. We would go roller skating on a Woolman rink, but we always took the subway. There was just no issue about it. There was one really horrible episode. I remember it because it was traumatic. We're sitting on the subway and there's this man sitting across from us. Did I tell you this story?
No, I don't think so.
Disgust me now. And he has a raincoat on. Already you know what I'm going to tell you.
Oh boy.
And he's sitting and his hand, I guess had men's raincoats were made that the pocket, you could
Okay.
reach your pants pocket
Yeah.
through it, in case you had your wallet there or whatever.
Yeah.
And he wasn't reaching for his wallet.
Right.
And it must have been 12. I mean, so naive. We had, and we were looking at each other. We were like frozen. We didn't know what to do.
So there were a few of you there. Or
Yeah,
just,
at least
a few
3
girls.
or 4.
Yeah.
And a man got up and picked him up like this by his collar.
Yeah.
And threw him off the train when the train stopped at the next
Oh.
stop.
Was your father excited that you were going to college? Because you said your mother could take or leave it.
Yeah, she could take it or leave it, her philosophy was, and she said those words to me, you don't need a college degree to wash diapers. I mean, that was horrible. And my father, he actually supported it.
Did you know what you wanted to study right away, or was it one of those things where you
Well,
take a couple years?
In those days, you had a lot of prerequisites, a lot of papers. There was no word processing.
When you had to do papers then, is it a
I didn't
typewriter?
have an electric typewriter.
Is it
I
a
had
manual
a
typewriter or are you
manual
doing
typewriter.
longhand?
It was called erasable paper, and it had a strange texture, but you could actually erase the
If
ink.
you messed up, you
You
wouldn't
made
have to
an
start all
error
over.
and then
Yeah,
retype that part.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they were pretty messy, those papers, you know.
Yeah, but we did them,
And
didn't
then
we?
people did
Yeah,
pay people to type for them. You
yeah,
know, they get people to type their papers, but I had no money. I couldn't do it.
yeah,
The college was built in the 1800s. That's
yeah.
how old the buildings were. And I was taking some kind of science, maybe biology. And this guy was walking around, and when a class would get out and said, oh, we need subjects for psychology experiment, any volunteers? I was 18 years old. I said, sure. And I went up to this room on the next floor, and his name was, let's say, Arthur. And then his lab partner was Jack.
Do you remember seeing him for the first time or being intrigued by him, or was it one of those things where it
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
snuck
love
up?
at first sight. I
It
mean,
was at first sight. Boom.
he's very, very handsome, drop dead gorgeous. And he was interested, I could tell. Either that time or the next time, because then, of course, they had to follow up with the experiment. It was
Right,
industrial psychology, you know, I knew
right.
nothing more about myself than I did when I walked in the door. And I think he said, oh, let's go get a soda. You know, that was a big thing. And I had to walk back to the subway, and he had to walk back to get bus to go home. And there were a lot of kosher delicatessens. We went to Saul's Delicatessen, I remember that. And we went in, and I don't remember if it was air conditioned, but we got a can of soda.
Do you remember at the time thinking, I would love to have a boyfriend now, or I'm focused on school, or were you like kind
I
of
didn't even
thinking
think
about
about a boy.
romance?
I
No.
didn't, no, it was not looking for a boyfriend kind of thing, no. He didn't live far from the college. He lived in an area called Washington Heights. There is something called the cloisters, which is part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Cloisters that were brought to the United States by the Rockefeller family. And we took the bus, and it's along the Hudson River. And
Mhm.
they had a Greek portico right at the river. And we took a walk, and we went into the Greek portico, and that was the first time he kissed me. And
Amazing.
then he said, let's stop at my house. I want you to meet my mother. We took the bus, and I met his mother, and she said, either at the beginning, the middle, or the end of the time that I was there, in her German accent, she said, Jackie, that's it. And we got married. I was 20. I still had another year of college to go. We got married, and we had a little apartment, and I got up and went to school and did my student teaching and became a graduate. It all worked out.
So how long were you dating before you got married? A couple
2
years?
years.
2 years. Do you remember the proposal? What was the proposal like?
I think he spoke to my parents, and it was kind of understood between us, but no,
Yeah.
he didn't get down on his hands and knees, you know. Although when he gave me the engagement ring, it was with his family. And my parents, it was the thing that we should all be in one place together,
Right.
you know, rather than just the two of us. My parents couldn't be there for some reason, and he took the ring and he threw it in a glass of champagne and said, will you marry me? And, you know, but it wasn't a private thing between the two of us. The ring has an interesting story. It was
Yeah.
from his mother's family, and in the 30s, they had to leave Germany, and there were a few pieces of jewelry that were put into a box and wrapped up, and it was hidden by the local butcher. And I remember my mother-in-law getting it back. It took many, many years to get it back. And then the ring in there, which was a beautiful ring, was my engagement ring.
When you guys were first dating, what were the things you would do on dates? Where would
Went
you
to
go
the
dancing?
movies. We went to, there was a place you could go dancing in Manhattan. We would do that. I remember one date we went to see Benny Goodman. I mean, that's how old we are. Or so was he at that time. He was,
Sure.
and that was on top of Rockefeller Center. We would go to Central Park, museums, a lot of family things. maybe bowling every now and then.
Sure. Did you guys have a song?
I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles. Yes, it was playing when we were dating. The Beatles were a big thing. It was just something I always thought, I just want to hold his hand.
Talk to me about your wedding. Where was it
Oh, that
and
was a
what was it
big
like?
deal. It was a Sunday afternoon in August, and we were married not very far from here in Hollis Hills Jewish Center. And, they had a big space, very beautiful, and lots of flowers and family and dancing and happiness. My grandmother
Sure.
was still alive at that time, so she was at the wedding. And she must, about 6 months later, she died. I don't know whose bright idea it was, but Jack's friends took him on a bachelor night,
Yeah.
which was absolutely ridiculous. The night
Yeah.
before, and I guess he had too much to drink. And he didn't want to get up that morning, his parents said, and they threw him in a bathtub of cold water. And he showed up, and then by the end of the day, the hangover was
He got
gone.
with it. He got with the program.
He
What did
did.
you wear? Did you like the way
Oh,
your
a beautiful white wedding gown,
yeah.
the veil and the whole thing.
Did you guys have a honeymoon?
We went to Miami. We went to the Deauville Hotel. Oh, we won a dance contest, a cha-cha contest, but we always danced. I
Yeah.
like dancing. We decided it was time, and Jack had a job, and we moved from our apartment. We bought a house. So then we had room to put, a baby, another room. And then Jeff was born in September, and I worked through June 30th. And then took maternity leave. And then came William. In the mid-70s, I went back to work. Jeffrey was in school, and William was in all-day kindergarten. And, we managed. We had somebody at the end of the day pick them up from the bus and that kind of thing until I came home.
Talk to me about the house that you guys got. What was it like?
It was a house built in the 1930s during the Depression. It was a 3-bedroom colonial, nothing, nothing fancy, 40 by 100 lot, driveway, no garage, 1 bathroom, and then we stayed for 43 years. So we added an addition, we added a bathroom, we redid the bathrooms, we redid the kitchen.
Do you remember what it was like to go back to work after taking the break?
I came home early, so therefore, whoever had to go to music lessons or soccer practice or whatever, I got home, the babysitter left, and I did the driving and picking up. And then, of course, there was dinner. And I did a lot. It was a lot.
What do you remember about being a new mom?
It was exhilarating.
You loved it.
Yeah, I did. No, it was wonderful. It was a joy. It was a miracle. And Jeff was a really a calm baby. He wasn't a crier or anything, and he wasn't demanding. And we had this frieze in his room, the alphabet, A is for this, B is for that. Good morning, he got up in his crib and he went A, B. He just knew it because we used to go through the alphabet with him. And then when he was not quite 2, we were in a store, and he pointed and he said, exit, to the exit sign.
Wow.
So he really taught himself to read.
He was bright.
Still is.
Right. Why did you name him Jeffrey?
Because in tradition, you name after a deceased relative. He was named after my grandfather, Jake. So we
Nice.
kept the first initial.
What about
Yeah.
William's name? Where did that come from?
Also after a grandfather, Jack's side of the family, Wilhelm. He became William.
How was William as a baby?
He was a crier and,
Yeah.
tantrums and, but adorable. Absolutely adorable. We had a double stroller, and William sat in the front. Jeffrey sat behind him, and so he could pull his brother's hair. We go to parks. We belonged to a pool in the summer, so we would go to a pool. We would go to the beach. But Jack didn't like going to the beach in the summer with them because there was so much to bring. They couldn't just sit and, well, I guess they could, but we were very protective. So we had to have an umbrella, and they had to have a place that they could take a nap. What else did we do? We went for walks. We went to the playground. We went on the swings. Probably the movies. Jeffrey probably went to the movies at a very young age. I don't remember when.
But right, but he always loved them. Do you remember moments where you realized, oh, they're their own people, and I
Yeah,
can?
as they became, when they were older,
Right.
when they really could be more independent, and they were their own thing. They did not have the same interests. They did not have the same temperament. They did not have the same goals. Sometimes they say, are they even related? They just was so different from each other. They were brothers, but once they got older and had their own independence and their own friends, the friends didn't commingle.
What was it like when the boys became teenagers?
Jeffrey wasn't wild. He was not wild. William was the wild child. He had his own rules and his own friends, and his choice of friends were not always what I would say I would have chosen for him. But he did his thing. He was going to be a rock star, and I said, "Well, I think you have to learn how to play an instrument," which he had the opportunity to do that. He had this group called Triple Trouble, and they were like, I guess, the Beastie Boys of the time. I don't know, three guys. He was not academic at all, and he didn't really like school. It was a challenge. It was a
Yeah.
challenge.
Do you remember Jeffrey falling in love with movies?
Always,
Yeah.
always. And going to the movies was a big deal. He used to say to my mother, to his grandmother, I'm going to go to Hollywood and I'm going to build you a house. That he had this vision of what Hollywood was. He always loved the movies. He always loved the movies, and he always knew he was going to go to California. When kids have a passion, it's
Right.
much easier for them and for the family. If it's something, a good direction. So we always encouraged him. It is hard, absolutely, because you're
Yeah.
independent. When he was finishing college, I'd say, well, you have any job interviews? I remember when we were leaving college, when Jack was leaving college, you had job interviews, you lined it up.
Yeah.
And he says, no. And I think that was the beginning of how work changed. People were independent and didn't so much rely on a corporation.
But worrying about them and thinking about
Always, it
them,
never stops.
it never stops.
It
How do
never
you
stops.
learn to live with that?
Well, when there's a big distance geographically, when they're older, it's
Yeah.
easier.
Yeah.
When they're in your space, so to speak, an easy car ride, it's more difficult because you can see them more frequently.
Yeah.
But my expression is you stuck it up.
Yeah.
You've done your best,
Yeah.
and there's not much more influence that you can have at a
And at
certain.
a certain point, you have to give them
You have
freedom,
to let
and
it
yeah,
go.
you have to
Right.
let it go. What have you loved about being a mother?
Well, every phone call ends with "I love you." That's very sweet. I like
It is
that.
very sweet.
And big hug is a good thing. What do I, just the connection, and that you created a soul. And I look at William and the two great children, and to continuing a legacy and a family and keeping it together.
When you look back at your life, was there a time you were like, wow, that was a really happy time?
Yeah, at the beginning of marriage, and there was a future. It was ahead of you. It isn't that way anymore. We always did the right thing. We were
Yeah.
not we were not rebels. We didn't burn a draft card, but I sympathize with the young men that went to Vietnam, that we shouldn't be there. The country shouldn't be influencing the rest of the world. I mean, I had great sympathy, but as I said, we didn't burn our draft cards.
How did your extended family factor into your day to day when you were raising your kids and working and?
Well, when my mother moved to Florida when the boys were like little, because my father died and that was their plan to go to Florida, and she went. But my in-laws were helpful. Before I went back to work full time, you could work a day, be a substitute. And sometimes I get the phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. And my father-in-law would pick up William and spend the day with him. And William liked that. He liked my father-in-law.
Would you go and visit your mom when she moved to Florida? Were those
Oh,
trips?
of course. When she first moved to that area of Florida, there were orange groves and strawberries, and we would take the kids to pick strawberries. It's different than what it was. It's becoming really all these
Right.
sweet little houses knocked down, and they're building, these gazillion dollar homes, and it's not the little town that it used to be. it was always casually dropped at home, what the expectation was to become a teacher. And I think once I said, maybe being a lawyer would be good. Oh, that was another thing. I worked for a dermatologist, a very famous dermatologist, because our neighbor worked for him. They needed someone part-time. So I
Right.
would go from high school, which was walking distance, to the Main Street subway station. And I would take that train and have to change to another train to go to the Upper East Side. And I worked there part-time. And this doctor, who was the developer of hair transplants, he was the first one to do that. And he had famous clients, Andy Warhol and Truman Capote, and it was a lot of blood. They had to remove the hair from the back and put it in the top. So they would
Oh,
punch holes.
yeah.
Remember a lot of guys coming out holding their head with, and the bandages
With
were all.
bloody gauzes. And you would be out in the front. You wouldn't watch them
Oh, yeah,
actually
yeah. I
happen.
had nothing to, I was not a
Yeah.
medical, I had
Yeah.
nothing to do with medicine. I'd hand out, make appointments or do whatever clerical things. All the doctors were men and
Yeah.
all the support service nurses and whatever, uh, technicians were all women. And then I do remember something very poignant. Somebody came in and was a Holocaust survivor, and they had the numbers on their arm. And person came out, he removed them. I don't think it was me, maybe someone, I looked at the chart and there was no charge. So
He did it for
did,
free.
yeah. He once said to me, "What are you going to do?" 'Cause by then I was in college. And he said, "Well, do you ever think of being a doctor?" And it was such an expectation that I said, "Me? You know,
Right. You
no."
you you had already been sort of like groomed to not even think that that could be even be a
Exactly, that's the
possibility.
word.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I said, "No." I said, I couldn't do that." He said, "Yes, you could. And I'll help you." And it just went out of my head. And
Yeah.
well, by the time I went to college, my first semester, I met Jack. So I certainly wasn't going to go to medical school.
What do you remember about your college graduation?
It was outdoors on the campus. And I remember wearing the cap and gown, and it was very exciting. Then I started to work that September. I had a job and got on the subway. The subway was a big part of my life, and went to
Yeah.
work. And then I eventually drove my little Volkswagen Bug with the canvas sunroof.
What was your degree in?
I had a Bachelor of Science in Education.
And
And then entitled me to teach, I think it was K through kindergarten through 9. And then I went on to get a master's degree in library science.
you were teaching. What was your first job right out of college? Where was it?
Full-time, real job, not part-time.
Yeah.
Was in an elementary school in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And it was in this really, really old building, because that's a very old neighborhood, Greenpoint. And that's where I worked. And then trying to have some babies.
When you went back to work, did you like being back at the job? Were you
Oh, I
happy to be?
loved it. I really loved it. After a while, being home with very young children can get a little, well, exhausting
Yeah.
and not very stimulating.
What are the parts of teaching that you love the most?
At the end of June,
When it's over?
the camaraderie and making friends and feeling, when kids got it, when they understood something, you felt successful.
Are there like smells or things that take you back to schools? Like when you think of like chalkboards and things like that, like the day to day of it.
The paste, the
Yeah, you think of the paste.
paste. The smell from the cafeteria when the kids' lunch was being whatever they did with them, heated
Yeah,
them or cooked it or that, and the cleaning products. When you would go into the bathroom, that strong
and smell it.
um, disinfectant smell. I do remember that.
Did you teach the same grade for most of your career, or did you kind of do different levels at
I
different
taught the
ages?
6th grade, and then
Yeah.
when I after maternity leave, I taught the 2nd grade. Then I think I taught the 5th, then I was in the library in an elementary school, and then I got my master's in library science, and I went on to high school to really be a librarian, because in elementary school, it's called, you give teachers coverage, which was okay. It was enjoyable, but it wasn't a very well-staffed library, and there was no money for books, and it was just it was called coverage for a pep period. So a teacher might, the kids might go to gym with the gym teacher for 45 minutes, and they came to the library. But working in a high school was really, really a good job. I like that. When you teach on a lower level, all of a sudden I got the American Revolution. It clicked. It was good. And to reenact certain things in the civil rights movement, I used to line up the chairs, and I'd say, this is a bus, the Rosa Parks idea. Now you can't sit here, you have to sit in the back. Now get up, and so they understood what it meant to be not equal to everybody else.
That's remarkable. And
Yeah,
also that probably would not be allowed to be taught in some states now, the way things are going.
You're absolutely right. Because
you couldn't do your
woke,
Rosa Parks
right?
thing in Florida.
So woke.
It's too woke. Wow, that's kind of cool.
When they got a little older, the kids, and they would come back to visit, that was certainly very rewarding. And then in this one particular school in Greenpoint, every year on Flag Day, they'd close the street, and the kids, we would all produce a dance. And I remember it was great. I did New York, New York, because it was a very popular song at the time.
Of course.
And I used to take exercise class, like jazzercise.
Yeah.
We had a routine to that, so I taught it to the kids. And it didn't bring down the house, but it brought down the street. I mean, because it was outside. When I look back, I may have chosen a different career. I just never encouraged to do anything else. Not that it was a terrible thing to do, but I could have explored other things. I never took an aptitude test. What am I good for?
Yeah.
What would be a better job for me? But I did like children. I did like interacting with them, and there were opportunities. I don't know what other careers, if there were opportunities. I mean, I have cousins who are very creative artists, and life is difficult.
Yeah.
You're not Van Gogh, but Van Gogh never saw any.
That's true. His life wasn't that great either. And so when you moved into the library type work, was that fulfilling in a different way? What did you love about it?
Well, you weren't always working with students. You were working with teachers to, help them develop a lesson, or to provide books for them. Also to teach library science. How do you find a book in the library? And that was pre-computers, pre-online catalog. Sometimes it became a holding place for kids during lunch period, because they didn't want to go to the cafeteria, which was a little crazy sometimes. So they come to the library, and that was fine. They could come, they could read, they could take out a book, do their homework. They used to close the library for certain meetings, like all the AP assistant principals, social studies were meeting in an hour school. So I said, well, what happens to the library that day? It just was, because the library was a beautiful place. And
it was a refuge for people, probably a haven.
It was, and people like to meet in the library. It always looked very academic and very studious, as opposed to meeting in a classroom somewhere, which was a chalkboard and chairs. So I enjoyed that job.
When you were growing up, was the Holocaust talked about a lot?
It was not spoken, and even in school, when it really hit was when they released films, and my brother, who, as I said, was an academic, and he watched them, and I watched them with him, and but I'm trying to remember how old I was then. I was an early teenager, so that must have been late 50s. The films were finally released, because people really didn't know. I remember my mother watching a little bit too, and she said, don't watch it anymore. It's too sad. It was.
Have you been to those places? Have you traveled to any of those
places?
places?
Been to one concentration camp, Theresienstadt, which was the one where was supposedly the model concentration camp. that there was Red Cross film
Yeah.
taken there, and there was a play. There was a children's wing, and there was a play, Rudabond, I think it was, and we even took our grandchildren to see it because the play was done on Broadway. Well, Arbeit macht free,
Yeah.
work makes you free when you walk in.
Mm.
But it wasn't a kid, not that it makes it better, but it wasn't a killing camp. It's kind of a holdover camp. Then we discovered that Jack's grandfather died there. We actually saw his name listed, Germans kept great records, and we saw his name in this book. I forgot the year. And they were memorial candles that you could light. And there was a cemetery.
And I remember you telling me the story of how you got bat mitzvahed later.
Yeah, yeah. It was something that wasn't offered to me, but was certainly offered to my brother. But now, of course, that has changed. I don't know if I told you the story. When my grandfather died, my grandmother and the family then was a lot more Orthodox. I wouldn't say religious, but Orthodox. And there would be a prayer every day, and it was called the Minyan service. And my
Nice.
mother said, "Oh, we can't do it yet. We need 10 people." And I go around the room and I said, "There are 10 people here." I must have been 6 or 7.
Wow.
And she said, "Well, women don't count." It's true. She really said that. I mean, now, of course, they count because, well, we belong to a Reformed congregation. But I think that was always in my mind, and that
Yeah.
when I had that opportunity to be just like everybody else,
Right.
no sexism about religion. So that was a defining moment for me.
Culture.
Another example is in high holidays, it's called a Torah service. So,
Mhm.
the scroll is carried. So they would have this procession, and it was all men. And I wrote a letter to the ritual committee, and I said, "Why aren't there any women in this Torah processional? This is a Reformed congregation." "Well, they're too heavy for women to carry." I said, "Well, when my babies were almost 30 pounds and hadn't walked yet, who carried
Right.
who carried
If
the
I could
first?"
carry those babies, I could carry that scroll.
Right. And the
Wow.
next year, women were in the processional. So I made some changes.
When you think about your bat mitzvah, the night of it, what are the moments that stand out that you'll always remember?
Well, I got to make a speech.
Yeah.
Not everybody wanted to do it. That's very traditional, make a speech. And I
Right.
made a little speech. And I actually thank my boys for understanding when I had to go out to a practice session or to a class or something. It was very much a sense of community. Jack has become much more spiritual at this time of his life. And I'm not.
What has it been like to observe that with him, though?
A little confusing,
Yeah.
a little confusing because it was not that way, you know, years ago, not at all. I mean, he was involved with the temple and
Sure.
very much part of our lives, but I didn't notice that it was particularly a spiritual thing for him,
Right.
but it's become that now.
How did you change throughout your life? Are there ways that you're still sort of the same, and then ways that, wow, I've shifted on some things?
Well, to better understand the dynamics of a family, it was very hard for me to accept that everybody wasn't going in the right path. Definitely have changed that, I'm
Yeah.
more, if I knew then what I know now, maybe there wouldn't be so much anger.
Right. There
So
wouldn't have been so much pain and anger, like,
pain and anger, but that has definitely changed. You talked about a person's sexuality.
yeah.
I didn't even know what a gay person was. It was just not part of the language, a part
Right.
of the. It just didn't, wasn't there. I didn't
Right.
know anything. The first time I realized that something was, I guess the word different would work. I
Sure.
went to see the Boys in the Band movie, and
Yeah.
it gave me an understanding. And there was someone at work, and he was very disappointed because his friend couldn't go on a trip with him. And I said, well, you'll go with another friend. But I didn't understand what friend meant to him.
Right.
But when I saw Boys in the Band, I got a better picture of what he was going through. And then when Jeffrey came out, it was an adjustment,
Yeah.
but I did bibliotherapy. I read all of these books, and I read very sad stories
Yeah.
about men who committed suicide
Right.
because they only wanted to be accepted.
Yeah.
By their families,
Yeah.
and they were rejected. That's horrible,
Yeah.
absolutely horrible.
When Jeffrey came out to you, did you go like, I had a feeling, or was it like, oh, I had no idea? Indicators along the way, like not that interested in girls
I
or
had no
anything.
idea.
No idea. How old was he when he around that time?
21 maybe. Jack worked in New Jersey at that time, and it
Yeah.
really wasn't far from Purchase, New York, where Jeffrey went to school.
Yeah.
So he said, I'm gonna go out to dinner with Jeffrey tonight. I said, that's great. And then the next morning he said, Jack told me what he said. And I said to him, what are you talking about? You know, it was just it was a learning experience, it was an adjustment.
Has it been heartening to see the work that he's done and how impactful it is?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And he's beloved by the people who see the movies. We even went to see his movie last week at Boulevard, A Hollywood Story. It was
Y-
playing about a 35-40 minute drive from here, and we went to see it. And we had never seen it on the big screen because of COVID, and
Right.
we had seen it only on a desktop. So it was very rewarding to see it. And
Right.
well, it was appreciated by the audience. Well, William had some major issues, and that was really very stressful for both of us. As they say, knock wood, he's doing great. He's doing okay.
What did you learn from going through that?
What did I learn?
Yeah.
That I can get through major things.
That you're tough, that you're tougher than maybe you thought.
Yeah, it was not easy, you know,
Yeah.
on many levels, and
Yeah.
there's a big amount of shame involved. But we had a consultation with somebody that Jeffrey had recommended. He arranged it, and the first thing she said was to both of us, to Jack and myself, it's not your fault. And that was very powerful, took this tremendous weight off. Because she
Right.
keeps saying, if I had done this, if I had done this,
Right.
the things would be different. I don't know. I think people just are what they are, and maybe things would have been different. I don't know. The real crisis was about 7 years ago, because I remember he came to Jeff and Talas's wedding, and he was not in a good place. It's probably 5-6 years that he's in recovery, so we're
Yeah.
very, very pleased about that.
What was it like for you when you retired?
I was ready.
You're
Yeah,
ready.
37 years, I
Yeah.
was ready. That was a long time. And all of a sudden, one day you get up and you say, I can't do this anymore. It was the right time. It was good. And I
Yeah.
enjoyed it. We had this group of people, and one woman would arrange it, and we would do something at a museum in Manhattan, or we'd go on a guided walk of Central Park. And those were good days. Those were really good. Oh, and then I became a docent. As soon as I retired, I applied to be a docent at the Nassau Museum of Art, and I did that for 13 years.
So you would
37.
walk around with people and explain things and
Yeah, and there were 3 to 4 shows every year, and you had to learn the show. It's not like a history museum, with everything stays the same. This was, changing the art exhibit, and that was good. I enjoyed that, and I made a lot of good friends that are still my friends now. So I like that very much. But then it was COVID, and so everything stopped, and I was getting a little exhausted from constantly learning these new. I love
yeah.
learning things, but it was getting to be a bit much. And then Jack had retired, so I wanted not to be committed to this, because you have to, you had to get 75 credits and do it on Sundays, and it was a whole complicated thing.
Right.
So it was time to say goodbye. I actually loved Norman Rockwell. I love what he could capture, what the United States was in its time. He did some interesting work, and I love the 4 freedoms that he did. And I
Yeah.
think about it now, if we only could be those four freedoms again, freedom from want, freedom from, I've forgotten them now.
Right.
Uh,
I'd never heard of them. So this was
oh,
something
they
that
were
he created.
posters.
Yeah.
They were posters. I think during the 30s he did it. I was also very involved in our temple. I was the vice president of the congregation, and I was a chapter leader of my school, in the union. And yeah, I did a lot, did a lot. Never been afraid of somebody saying no to me. I never been afraid to ask or to change something. They say no, move on.
Were you going to say something else about an area that we might have talked about, or anything else that
No, when I look back on it, I have not that not that it's over, but I
right.
had a good life. I had opportunities. I had friends.
Yeah.
Economically, we never really suffered, and we had lots of travel and family events, and I was very lucky. I have no regrets, and I have a lot of grateful.
Yeah.
Whether it's a spiritual thing that gave it to us, I don't know, but we
Right.
worked hard. You
Yeah.
know, it was not easy sometimes. You know,